Wyoming Territory, 1885. The land was a study in permanence and brutality. It was a place that did not care for the man who scratched a life from its surface, a canvas of sagebrush and stone that swallowed sound and ambition with equal indifference. The sky was a vast, unforgiving blue, a dome so wide it seemed to press down on the soul, reminding a man of his own insignificance. For Elias Thorne, this indifference was a kind of solace. It asked nothing of him, and he, in turn, had learned to ask nothing of it. His ranch was nestled in a shallow valley, a modest collection of buildings that seemed to have grown from the earth itself. The main house, built of sturdy pine logs he had felled and shaped with his own hands, stood against the wind. A barn, a corral, and a scattering of outbuildings completed the picture of lonely self-sufficiency. From the porch where he sat, oiling a bridle, Elias could see the entire world he had constructed for himself. It was a world of order, of hard work from sunup to sundown, a world where the only conversations were with his horse and the quiet, capable presence of his housekeeper, Martha, who came up from the town of Solitudes in 3 times a week. Elias ran a hand over the worn leather, the scent familiar and grounding. His hands were calloused, the knuckles scarred from a life of labor and a war he tried not to remember. He was a tall man, built lean and hard like the fence posts he drove into the unyielding soil. His face, weathered by sun and wind, was a mask of stoicism, his dark eyes holding a deep, settled sorrow that he never allowed to surface. It had been 5 years since he had buried his wife, Sarah, and their infant son, Thomas, in the small plot behind the house, marked by 2 simple wooden crosses. He had buried his heart with them. He had learned a lesson in that frozen winter ground. Love was a vulnerability. Attachment was a seed for pain. A man who stood alone could not be broken by loss. He could bend with the wind, endure the drought, and survive the blizzard because his roots were anchored only in himself. This philosophy had become his armor. Each day of solitude, another layer of steel forged around the hollow space where his family used to be. He did not feel lonely. He felt safe. Loneliness was a yearning for what was lost. He had trained himself not to yearn. The silence of the valley was broken by a faint, mournful cry that carried on the wind. The weekly train. It was a sound that belonged to another world, a world of commerce and connection, of people coming and going, their lives tangled up with one another. Elias usually paid it no mind. It was a distant clock, marking the passage of another week in his ordered existence. But today the sound snagged on something inside him. It felt different, sharper, a harbinger of disruption to the careful peace he had cultivated. He paused his work, his gaze fixed on the distant pass where a plume of black smoke smudged the pristine sky. A tremor of unease, unfamiliar and unwelcome, passed through him. It was a feeling he had not experienced in a long time, a sense that the world he had so carefully walled off was about to be breached. He dismissed it as foolishness, a trick of the wind, and bent his head back to his work, the rhythmic motion of his hands a familiar prayer against the intrusion of the outside world. Clara Abernathy stepped down from the train onto the splintered platform, her gloved hand clutching the handle of her valise. The dust of Solitudes and immediately settled upon the hem of her fine wool traveling dress, a deep emerald green that had seemed so fashionable in Boston, but here felt as out of place as a songbird in a coyote's den. The air was thin and sharp, smelling of dust, pine, and something wild and untamed. The town was little more than a single, wide street lined with rough-hewn wooden buildings, their false fronts like tired faces staring out at the vast, empty landscape that stretched to the horizon in every direction. She scanned the small crowd on the platform, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She was looking for Mr. Jedediah Kane, the man whose letters had promised a prosperous ranch, a respectable life, and a gentle partnership. His words, written in a surprisingly elegant script, had painted a picture of a thriving homestead and a shared future, a haven for an orphan with no prospects left in the East. But as her gaze swept over the weathered faces of the men gathered there, ranchers, miners, drifters, a cold knot of apprehension tightened in her stomach. None of them matched the dignified, silver-haired gentleman she had imagined. A man detached himself from the shadow of the general store, his approach a swaggering roll. He was large and unkempt, with a stained vest stretched tight over a protruding belly and a florid face that spoke of too much whiskey. A greasy smile split his beard. "You must be the little filly from back east. Clara, is it?" His voice was a coarse rumble, nothing like the refined prose of his letters. Clara felt a wave of revulsion. This could not be him. "I am looking for Mr. Jedediah Kane," she said, her own voice sounding thin and reedy to her ears. He laughed, a wet, unpleasant sound. "Well, you found him. Jed Kane, in the flesh." He gestured broadly to himself. "Welcome to your new home, sweetheart." He reached for her valise, his intentions clear. He meant to take possession of it, and of her. Elias had finished his business at the mercantile, loading sacks of flour and coffee into the back of his wagon. He was about to climb up when he saw her. She was like a jewel dropped in the dirt, a splash of vibrant green against the monotonous browns and grays of the town. Her hair, the color of warm honey, was pinned in an elegant coil, though tendrils had escaped to frame a face that was pale with fatigue and anxiety. He saw the hope in her posture, the rigid set of her shoulders as she searched the crowd, and he felt an old, forgotten pang of something that might have been pity. Then he saw Kane approach her. Elias knew Jed Kane. He was a blowhard, a cheat, and a bully, a man who was buying up land through intimidation and foreclosure, his greed as vast as the territory itself. The idea that this refined woman had come all this way for a man like Kane soured the air. He heard Kane's booming voice, saw the woman flinch, and watched as her hopeful expression crumbled into one of dawning horror. When Kane reached for her arm, a possessive, brutish gesture, something inside Elias snapped. The carefully constructed walls of his indifference cracked. He did not think. He simply moved. He crossed the dusty space in a few long strides, his boots silent in the dirt. He did not touch Kane. He did not need to. He simply stopped beside Clara, his shadow falling over both of them. His presence was a physical thing, a quiet but absolute assertion of power. "Kane," Elias said, his voice low and flat. "The lady seemed surprised to see you." Kane's hand dropped from Clara's arm. He turned, his bravado faltering as he met Elias's cold, steady gaze. "Thorne, this ain't your concern. This is my business. My intended," he spat the word out. Elias looked at Clara. Her face was ashen, her blue eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. He saw the truth of the situation in that one look. She had been deceived, lured here under false pretenses by a man who saw her as nothing more than property. "It seems to me," Elias said, his voice still dangerously quiet, "that the lady has not yet agreed to any business with you. Is that right, ma'am?" Clara found her voice, a small but resolute spark. "That is correct. There has been a grave misunderstanding." She looked directly at Kane, her chin lifting. "I will not be accompanying you, Mr. Kane." Kane's face purpled with rage. He took a step forward, but Elias shifted his weight slightly, a subtle movement that promised swift and decisive violence. Kane hesitated, weighing his chances. He was a bully, not a fool. He knew Elias Thorne's reputation. He jabbed a finger in Elias's direction. "You'll regret this, Thorne. Both of you." He turned and stomped away, disappearing into the saloon. The confrontation left a ringing silence in its wake. Clara stood frozen, the reality of her situation crashing down on her. She was alone, thousands of miles from anything familiar, with no money, no prospects, and an enemy she had made within minutes of her arrival. A single tear escaped and traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. Elias felt a surge of profound irritation, mostly with himself. He had interfered. He had gotten involved. This was precisely what he had spent 5 years avoiding. But he could not leave her standing in the middle of the street, a target for every vulture in town. "The boarding house is just down the way," he said, his tone gruff to hide the unwelcome stirring of compassion. "I can give you a ride." She looked at him, her gaze filled with a desperate gratitude that made him uncomfortable. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne. Elias Thorne." He gestured to his wagon. As he helped her up, her foot slipped on the step. She cried out, stumbling forward directly into his arms. For a moment, she was pressed against his chest. He could feel the frantic beat of her heart, smell the faint scent of lavender that clung to her clothes, a scent of gardens and civilization. It was an intimacy so sudden and unexpected it felt like a jolt of lightning. He steadied her, his hands firm on her arms, and then released her, as if she were a hot coal. He turned away quickly, his own heart hammering against his ribs, and climbed into the driver's seat, the warmth of her presence a brand against his skin. The boarding house, a grim, two-story building run by a woman with a perpetually sour expression, was full. The silver boom in the next county had filled every spare room in Solitude's Inn with prospectors. Clara stood on the porch, her valise at her feet, the proprietress's sharp refusal still echoing in her ears. The sun was beginning to dip below the jagged peaks of the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, a beautiful and lonely spectacle. For Clara, it was the color of despair. Elias, having seen the exchange from his wagon, swore under his breath. He could not just leave her there. His conscience, a thing he thought long dormant, would not allow it. He drove the wagon over to the sheriff's office, a small, solid building with a single barred window. Sheriff Brody was an older man, his face a road map of wrinkles, but his eyes were sharp and missed little. "Saw that business with Kane," Brody said, leaning back in his chair as Elias entered. "Figured you'd be the one to step in. You always did have a soft spot for lost causes. She is nowhere to stay," Elias stated flatly, ignoring the jibe. "The boarding house is full." Brody chewed on his mustache. "Well, the only other place with rooms is the saloon, and that's no place for a lady like that. Especially not with Kane stewing in there." He looked at Elias, a knowing glint in his eye. "You got that big house, Elias. And Martha's there, ain't she?" Perfectly respectable, Elias's jaw tightened. The suggestion was exactly what he had feared. His house was his sanctuary, his fortress against the world. To bring this woman, this stranger who carried the scent of lavender and trouble, into his home felt like a violation. "No," he said, the word clipped. "No." Brody raised an eyebrow. "So, you're going to leave her on the street for Kane to find once he's drunk enough to be brave? That the man you are now, Elias?" The sheriff's words hit their mark, striking at the core of honor that Elias could not shed, no matter how much he wished to. He thought of Sarah, of how she had always seen the good in him, even when he could not see it himself. Leaving this woman to fend for herself would be a betrayal of that memory. With a sigh of resignation that seemed to come from the soles of his boots, he turned and walked out of the office. He found Clara exactly where he had left her, a solitary figure silhouetted against the dying light. He pulled the wagon to a halt. "The boarding house is full," he said, stating the obvious. He cleared his throat, the words tasting like ash. "My ranch is a few miles out of town. I have a housekeeper, an older woman named Martha. There's a spare room. You can stay there until the next train east." Clara looked up at him, her eyes luminous in the twilight. She saw the reluctance in his face, the rigid set of his jaw. She understood he was offering this not out of desire, but out of a sense of duty he clearly resented. And yet, it was the only kindness she had been shown all day. "I could not possibly impose," she began, her pride warring with her desperation. "It's not an imposition," he lied, his voice rough. "It's a solution. Get in the wagon." His tone brooked no argument. Defeated and grateful in equal measure, she allowed him to help her up again, this time taking great care not to stumble. The ride to the ranch was silent, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. For Clara, it was a journey into the unknown. For Elias, it felt like a surrender. Martha was a small, wiry woman with hands gnarled by work and a gaze as sharp as a needle. She took in the sight of the elegant, exhausted woman on Elias's porch with a single, comprehensive glance and understood everything. She bustled Clara inside, clucking over her travel-worn state and immediately putting a kettle on the stove, her presence a whirlwind of practical comfort that filled the quiet house with a warmth it had not known in years. Later, they sat at the simple wooden table in Elias's kitchen. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Martha served a hearty beef stew, and despite her anxiety, Clara found she was ravenously hungry. The silence at the table was thick, broken only by the clink of spoons against pottery. Elias ate with a grim focus, his shoulders hunched as if warding off an attack. It was Martha who finally broke the spell. "So, dearie," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "you find yourself in a bit of a pickle." It seems Clara's composure, held together by a thread of pride all day, finally snapped. She put down her spoon, her eyes filling with tears. "A pickle seems too mild a word," she whispered. She explained her story in a rush of words. The death of her parents from influenza, the dwindling inheritance, the loneliness of her existence in Boston. She spoke of the advertisement in the newspaper, the hope in person. He was a monster. Elias listened, his expression unreadable. He had known Cain was a liar, but the depth of his calculated cruelty was sickening. He had preyed on this woman's hope, luring her across the country like a lamb to the slaughter. He felt a cold, hard anger settle in his gut. "Some men are just born rotten," Martha said, patting Clara's hand. "You've had a terrible loss, child. It's a hard thing to be left alone in the world." She looked pointedly at Elias. A hard thing indeed. Elias felt the weight of Martha's gaze. He knew she was thinking of Sarah and Thomas. He never spoke of them, not to anyone. The grief was a private, sacred wound. But looking at Clara, at the genuine desolation in her eyes, he heard himself speak, the words emerging rough and unused. "I lost my family, too. Some years back." He offered no details, no explanation. It was a stark, bare statement, a single brick pulled from the wall around his heart. Clara looked at him, her own sorrow momentarily forgotten. For the first time, she saw past his stoic exterior to the profound sadness that lay beneath. It was there in the lines around his mouth, in the shadows of his eyes. She saw a pain that mirrored her own, a shared landscape of loss. In that moment of shared vulnerability, a fragile connection was forged between them, a silent understanding that transcended words. "I am so sorry," she said softly, and the simple sentiment was imbued with a depth of meaning that resonated in the quiet kitchen. He simply nodded, unable to say more, and the silence that followed was no longer empty, but filled with a new and complex awareness of each other. The days that followed fell into a strange domestic rhythm. Clara, unwilling to be a helpless guest, insisted on helping Martha. She learned to knead bread, her soft hands growing stronger. She helped mend Elias's work shirts, her neat, precise stitches a stark contrast to Martha's more functional ones. She discovered a knack for gardening, tending to the small vegetable patch with a fierce determination. She was not the fragile, decorative creature Elias had first assumed. There was a core of steel beneath her refined exterior, a resilience that surprised him. He found himself watching her. He would see her from the barn, her honey-colored hair glinting in the sun as she hung laundry on the line, the simple fabric of her borrowed dress whipping in the wind. He would hear her humming a soft tune as she worked in the kitchen, a sound of life and contentment that had been absent from his house for so long it felt alien. He began to look forward to the evenings, to the quiet dinners where she would speak of books she had read or art she had seen, painting pictures with her words of a world so different from his own. She, in turn, began to see the man behind the mask. She saw the gentleness with which he treated his horses, the quiet pride he took in his land, the unwavering honor that had compelled him to help her. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression, the slight tightening of his jaw when he was worried, the rare, almost imperceptible softening of his eyes when something pleased him. She saw the loneliness he tried so hard to deny, a profound solitude that she instinctively understood. She began to ask him questions, not about his past, but about his present, about the land, the cattle, the way he knew a storm was coming by the color of the sky. "Why do you call this place Solitude's End?" she asked one afternoon, as they sat on the porch. She had been sketching the distant mountains in a small book she carried. He considered the question for a moment, his gaze on the horizon. The old trappers named it, said this valley was the last stop before the endless plains. The end of the mountains, the end of the trees. The end of everything but emptiness. I do not see emptiness, she said, her eyes on her drawing. I see beauty. It is a harsh beauty, perhaps, but it is powerful. It makes one feel small, but also part of something immense. He looked at her, truly looked at her. She saw the land not as an adversary to be conquered, but as something to be understood, to be appreciated. She was not like the other women he had known, who saw the frontier as a place of hardship to be endured. She saw its soul. A flicker of respect, warm and unfamiliar, sparked within him. He was beginning to see her not as a problem to be solved, but as a person, a woman of unexpected depth and strength. The walls he had built around himself were beginning to feel less like a fortress and more like a prison. The fragile piece of the ranch was not destined to last. Jedediah Kane was a man who did not forgive insults, especially public ones. He had been made to look a fool by a slip of a woman and the one man in the valley he could not intimidate. His anger festered, curdling into a venomous obsession. He wanted the woman, and he wanted Elias Thorne's land, which held the rights to the only reliable creek in the region. Now, the two desires were intertwined. His men began to appear in solitudes, end like carrion crows. They were rough men, hired guns with cold eyes, and an easy familiarity with violence. They did not cause trouble, not at first. They simply watched and listened, spreading poison in the form of rumors. They painted Clara as a conniving adventuress who had cheated honest Jedediah Kane, and Elias as a fool who had been taken in by her charms. The whispers followed Clara whenever she accompanied Martha into town for supplies, and though she held her head high, the hostile stares and hushed comments were like tiny, sharp stones. Elias saw the strain it put on her, the way her shoulders tensed and the light in her eyes dimmed. The anger he had felt in town hardened into a cold, protective rage. This was his fault. By bringing her into his life, he had made her a target. The thought was a bitter pill. He had sought to avoid attachments to prevent pain, but now his involuntary connection to this woman was putting her in direct danger. The threat escalated one bright, clear afternoon. Clara had taken her sketchbook and walked to a small rise overlooking the creek that watered Elias's land, a place of quiet beauty where wildflowers grew in defiance of the arid soil. She was absorbed in her drawing, capturing the play of light on the water, when she heard a low rumble. At first, she thought it was distant thunder, but the sky was a perfect, cloudless blue. The sound grew louder, a terrifying cacophony of pounding hooves and bellowing cattle. She looked up, and her blood ran cold. A portion of Elias's herd, dozens of panicked steers, was stampeding directly toward her. They were a wave of horns and hooves, their eyes wide with terror. There was nowhere to run, no time to think. She was frozen in place, a small, fragile figure in the path of a living avalanche. Elias had been mending a fence on the far side of the pasture when he saw the dust cloud. He knew instantly what it was and what it meant. This was no accident. He saw two riders peel away from the back of the herd, their work done, and his heart seized with a cold, primal fear he had not felt since the day the doctor had shaken his head and told him there was nothing more he could do for Sarah. He had seen Clara walking toward the rise earlier. She was there. She was in the path of the stampede. He vaulted onto his horse, his mind a blank slate of pure, unadulterated terror. He spurred the animal into a desperate gallop, leaning low over its neck, urging it on with a frantic prayer. The world narrowed to the space between him and the terrified woman on the rise. He could see her now, her green dress a tiny speck of color against the brown, surging mass of cattle. He rode not at the herd, but alongside it, his horse straining, its lungs burning. He had to get ahead of them, to cut her off from their path. Dust and grit filled his mouth, and the roar of the stampede was a physical force against him. He saw a steer at the edge of the herd stumble and go down, disappearing under a churning sea of hooves. He reached her just as the leaders of the herd were feet away. There was no time for finesse. He leaned far out of his saddle, hooked a strong arm around her waist, and hauled her bodily from the ground. She cried out in shock as he pulled her across his lap, her sketchbook falling from her hands to be trampled into the dirt. He wheeled his horse around in a spray of earth and galloped away, the hot breath of the lead steer on his heels. He did not stop until they were a safe distance away, the thunder of the stampede receding behind them. He slid from the saddle and gently lowered her to the ground. She was trembling uncontrollably, her face chalk white. He gripped her shoulders, his own body shaking with the aftershock of adrenaline and fear. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice raw. She shook her head, unable to speak. She looked at him, her eyes wide with the horror of what had just happened, and with a dawning realization of what he had just done. He had ridden into the face of death to save her. Without a thought for his own life, he had saved her. The raw, terrifying force of his protective instinct was a palpable thing between them. The professional distance he had tried to maintain was shattered. All that was left was the stark, undeniable truth. He cared for this woman. The thought of losing her, of seeing her broken and trampled, had ripped through his carefully constructed defenses and exposed the raw, vulnerable heart he thought he had buried forever. He pulled her against him, a rough, desperate embrace, burying his face in her hair. He held her as if he could absorb her fear into himself, as if by holding her tight enough, he could protect her from all the dangers of the world. The act was as much for his own comfort as it was for hers, a desperate affirmation that she was alive, she was safe, she was here. The aftermath of the rescue settled over the ranch like a heavy shroud. The immediate danger had passed, but it left behind a new and far more complicated threat. Elias's terror had not receded with the dust of the stampede. It had sharpened into a piercing clarity. He had allowed himself to feel again, and the feeling was inextricably linked with the prospect of loss. The fear that gripped him was a ghost, the echo of a pain so profound it had nearly destroyed him once before. He would not go through that again. He began to withdraw. The tentative warmth that had grown between them was extinguished, replaced by a cold, impenetrable distance. He became curt and formal, his conversations with Clara limited to brief, practical necessities. He avoided her gaze, and when their eyes did meet, his were shuttered and remote. He threw himself into his work with a grim ferocity, seeking exhaustion as a means of escape from his own thoughts. The easy companionship of the evenings vanished, replaced by a strained silence that was heavier and more oppressive than the solitude he had once cherished. Clara was bewildered and hurt. In the heart-stopping moments of the rescue, in the desperate, protective circle of his arms, she had felt the truth of his feelings for her. It was a truth she had felt mirrored in her own heart, a burgeoning affection and admiration that was quickly blossoming into something deeper. She had believed they had crossed a threshold, that the walls between them had finally crumbled. But now he was rebuilding them, higher and stronger than before. She could not understand it. She felt as if she had failed some unspoken test, that her presence, which had briefly seemed to bring a flicker of life back into his world, had now become an intolerable burden. The misunderstanding festered in the silence between them. He was pushing her away not because he did not care, but because he cared too much. He saw her now not as a person, but as a vulnerability, a walking reminder of his own capacity for pain. He saw Cain's shadow lengthening, saw the escalating threats, and concluded that as long as she was with him, she was in danger. His past had taught him a brutal lesson. Those he loved, he lost. The only way to protect her was to send her away. He finally cornered her one evening after dinner. Martha had discreetly retired to her small room, leaving them alone in the main room. A cold wind rattled the window panes, a fitting soundtrack to the storm brewing inside him. "The train comes through on Friday," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He did not look at her, focusing instead on a crack in the stone of the fireplace. "I will take you into town. You will be on it." The words were like a physical blow. Clara stared at his rigid profile, her heart sinking. "You are sending me away?" "It is for the best," he said, the phrase a dull, worn-out coin. "The best for whom?" Mr. Thorne?" she asked, a spark of anger cutting through her pain. "For you? Because my presence here is an inconvenience." He finally turned to face her, his eyes dark with a torment she could not decipher. "It is too dangerous for you here." Cain will not stop. What happened with the cattle was a warning. "The next time, you will not be so subtle, so you will send me away to be safe?" she challenged, her voice rising. "Or are you sending me away because you are a coward? Because you are afraid to feel anything? You hide in this valley, in this house, burying yourself in work and silence, and you call it strength. It is not. It is fear." Her words struck him with the force of a physical assault because they were true. He was a coward. He was terrified, but he could not admit it, not to her, not to himself. "I'm not a coward," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm a realist. You do not belong here. You are a delicate thing from the city. You cannot handle this life." The insult was deliberate, a cruel weapon designed to create a wound that would force her to leave. It worked. The color drained from her face, replaced by a mask of wounded pride. Her chin lifted. "You are right, Mr. Thorne. I do not belong here." Her voice was brittle as glass. "I will be ready on Friday, and I will trouble you no more." She turned and walked to her room, her back straight, leaving him alone with the hollow victory of his own self-inflicted misery. The night before her departure was thick with unspoken words and suffocating tension. A real storm had rolled in from the mountains, and rain lashed against the house in furious gusts. Elias sat by the fire, cleaning a rifle he had already cleaned twice that week, his movements mechanical. Every creak of the house, every howl of the wind, set his teeth on edge. He was doing the right thing. He was protecting her, but it felt like he was cutting out his own heart with a dull knife. Suddenly, his dog, a loyal mutt named Shadow, let out a low, guttural growl from his spot by the door. Elias froze, his hand tightening on a rifle. He had seen 2 of Cain's men riding the perimeter of his property that afternoon. This was it, the final confrontation. The back door splintered inward with a deafening crash. 2 men burst into the kitchen, their faces obscured by bandanas, pistols drawn. Elias was already moving, kicking his chair back and firing the rifle from his hip. The roar of the gun filled the small house. One of the men crumpled to the floor. The other fired back, the bullet splintering the wood of the mantelpiece inches from Elias's head. From the front of the house came the sound of shattering glass. Cain. He had brought more men. Elias dove behind the heavy oak table as another shot rang out. He was trapped, outnumbered. Clara, awakened by the first shot, threw open her bedroom door. She saw Elias taking cover, saw the 2 men advancing through the kitchen. Panic seized her for a heartbeat, cold and paralyzing. But then she saw the look on Elias's face, a grim, desperate resolve. This was her fault. Cain was here for him because of her. The thought ignited a fire in her veins. She would not be a helpless victim. She would not be a delicate thing. A lantern on a side table had been knocked over in the chaos, and a small fire was beginning to lick at the curtains. While the men were focused on Elias, Clara grabbed a heavy wool blanket from a nearby chest. She smothered the flames, her movements swift and decisive, her mind strangely clear. The immediate danger of the fire was averted. Elias fired again, taking down the second man in the kitchen. He knew Cain and at least one other were coming through the front. He was reloading, his hands moving with practiced speed, when he heard a noise from the side. The third man, having circled the house, had smashed a window and was climbing into the room, his gun leveled at Elias's exposed back. "Elias!" Clara screamed. There was no time for him to react. The man grinned, his finger tightening on the trigger. But Clara was already in motion. She grabbed the first thing she could find, the heavy cast-iron skillet Martha had left by the hearth. With a cry that was part fury and part terror, she swung it with all her might. The skillet connected with the side of the man's head with a sickening thud. He grunted, his eyes rolling back, and collapsed in a heap. At that moment, Jedediah Cain stepped through the shattered front doorway, a cruel smile on his face. "Well, Thorne, looks like your little bird has some fight in her." He raised his pistol, aiming it directly at Clara. "A pity I'll have to cage her permanently. Elias saw Cain's intent, and a red wave of pure rage washed over him. He launched himself from behind the table, not even bothering to aim the rifle, but using it as a club. He brought the stock down on Cain's arm, and the pistol clattered to the floor. Cain roared in pain and lunged, and the two men crashed to the floor in a desperate, brutal struggle. Outside, the sound of approaching horses and shouting could be heard. Sheriff Brody and a posse, alerted by a ranch hand who had seen Cain's men riding toward the Thorn place, were arriving. The fight went out of Cain. He shoved Elias away and scrambled for the door, but Brody was already there, his shotgun leveled. "It's over, Cain," in the sudden, ringing silence of the aftermath, with the smell of gunpowder and rain filling the air. Elias got to his feet. He ignored the sheriff, ignored the posse members subduing Cain's men. His eyes sought out only one person. Clara stood in the middle of the room, still holding the iron skillet, her knuckles white. Her dress was torn, her face smudged with soot, and she was trembling from head to toe. But her eyes were fierce, blazing with a courage that took his breath away. He walked toward her, his heart a painful, hammering drum in his chest. The image of Cain's gun pointed at her was burned into his mind. He had almost lost her. His foolish, cowardly pride had almost gotten her killed. The walls he had spent 5 years building did not just crumble. They were obliterated, turned to dust by the force of his terror and his love. He reached her and gently took the skillet from her hands, letting it fall to the floor with a clang. He pulled her into his arms, holding her not with the desperate fear of before, but with a reverence that shook him to his core. "Clara," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I am so sorry. I was wrong. I was so wrong." He pulled back just enough to look in her eyes. "I thought I could live alone. I told myself it was safer, that it was stronger. But I was just a coward, hiding from life. I can't live without you. I love you." The confession, the words he thought he would never speak again, poured out of him, a torrent of truth that washed away years of self-imposed solitude. Tears streamed down her face, washing away the soot. She looked at the wreckage of the room, at the vanquished threat, and then back at the raw, open vulnerability on his face. He looked broken, defeated by his own emotions. He thought he had failed her, failed to protect her. She reached up and cupped his jaw, her touch gentle but firm. "You didn't fail me, Elias," she said, her voice clear and steady despite the tears. "You saved me. From the moment I stepped off that train, you have done nothing but save me." The morning light streamed through the shattered windows of Elias's home, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and the grim evidence of the night's violence. Sheriff Brody and his men had taken Cain and his thugs away, leaving an eerie quiet in their wake. Martha had returned at dawn, her face a mask of shock that quickly melted into determined resolve as she began setting things to right, her quiet, bustling activity a balm to the raw nerves of the house. Elias and Clara stood on the porch, watching the sun climb over the mountains. The storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean and smelling of wet earth and sage. The world felt new, fragile, and filled with a terrifying, beautiful possibility. Elias held her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles, a simple, possessive gesture that spoke volumes. The barriers between them were gone, and in their place was a raw, tender intimacy. He turned to her, the morning light catching the exhaustion and profound relief in his eyes. "What I said last night, I meant every word, Clara." He took her other hand, holding both of them in his. "I know I have nothing to offer you. This house is half destroyed. My life is quiet and hard. It is not the life you were promised, not the life you deserve. The life I was promised was a lie," she said softly, her gaze unwavering. "And the life I thought I deserved in Boston was empty. This life," she squeezed his hands, "this life is real. And I am not afraid of quiet or of hard work." A slow smile, the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him, touched his lips. It transformed his face, erasing years of sorrow. "Good, because I cannot face it alone anymore." He reached into the small pocket of his vest and pulled out a simple, thin gold band. It was worn with age, its surface smooth and gleaming. This was my mother's. Her mother's before that. It is not much, but it is all I have of my past that is not touched by sadness. He looked down at the ring, then back up at her, his heart in his eyes. Clara Abernathy, I am asking you to share my future. I am asking you to make this broken house a home. Will you marry me? Tears welled in her eyes once more, but these were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She did not hesitate. Yes, she whispered. Oh, Elias. Yes, he slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He sealed his proposal not with a desperate, frantic embrace, but with a kiss that was gentle and full of promise, a quiet vow made in the clean light of a new day. The news of their engagement and of Jedediah Cain's final, violent act of villainy spread through solitudes and like a wildfire. The town, which had been swayed by Cain's whispers, now saw the truth. They saw Clara not as a scheming woman, but as a brave one who had stood her ground. They saw Elias not as a cold recluse, but as a man who had protected his own. The community, so often a source of suspicion and gossip, revealed its better nature. On the day of the wedding, a small ceremony held on the porch of the ranch house. It seemed the entire town turned out. Sheriff Brody stood as Elias's witness, and Martha, beaming with pride, stood for Clara. The ranchers and their families, the shopkeepers, and even the gruff blacksmith came, bearing gifts of food, tools, and homespun blankets. After the circuit preacher pronounced them man and wife, the men of the town, without being asked, set to work. They descended upon the damaged house with hammers, saws, and stacks of fresh milled lumber. They replaced the broken door, glazed the windows, and patched the bullet holes in the walls. The women took over the kitchen, preparing a feast that filled the valley with the scent of roasting meat and baking bread. It was a celebration not just of a wedding, but of a community reclaiming its own, a boisterous, joyful affirmation of the couple's place within it. Clara, standing beside Elias, watched the scene with a heart so full it felt it might burst. These were the people she had feared, the ones whose stares had wounded her. Now, they were her neighbors, her friends. They were helping to rebuild her home. She looked at Elias, at the way he talked and laughed with the other men, a comfortable camaraderie she had never seen in him before. He was no longer an island. He was part of this place, and now so was she. She had come to the West, seeking a home, and had found one in the most unexpected of ways, not in a lie written on paper, but in the heart of a man who thought he had nothing left to give, and in the spirit of a community that knew how to mend what was broken. 2 years later, the harshness of the Wyoming landscape remained, but it no longer seemed indifferent. Instead, its permanence felt like a promise. The seasons had turned, bringing snows that blanketed the valley in silence and springs that carpeted the foothills with wildflowers. The ranch had prospered under Elias's steady hand and Clara's thoughtful management. The house stood strong and whole, expanded now with a new room and a wide porch that wrapped around the front. On that porch sat a sturdy swing, a gift Elias had built for their first anniversary. Clara sat on that swing, the late afternoon sun warm on her face. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the cottonwood tree that shaded the yard. She was not the same woman who had stepped off the train 2 years ago. The fine silks and wools were gone, replaced by practical calico dresses. Her hands, though still cared for, bore the small calluses of a life of active work. Her face had a healthy color from the sun, and her eyes held a deep, settled contentment. She was sketching in her book, not the grand mountains, but the small, perfect face of the child playing at her feet. Samuel Thorne, a sturdy toddler with his father's dark, curly hair and his mother's bright blue eyes, chased a butterfly across the grass. His laughter was a clear, bright sound that filled the air. Clara smiled, her pencil moving swiftly across the page. She was 5 months pregnant with their second child, a gentle swelling beneath her dress, a quiet secret shared between her, Elias, and the peaceful valley. The emptiness she had once felt, the gnawing loneliness that had driven her across a continent, was a distant memory, a ghost from another life. She heard the familiar sound of his horse and looked up. Elias was riding in from the pastures, his silhouette dark against the golden light of the setting sun. He moved with an easy grace in the saddle, a man perfectly in his element. He dismounted at the barn, and a few minutes later walked toward the house, his stride long and sure. The mask of stoicism was gone. It had been replaced by an open, loving expression that was reserved only for her and their son. He smiled as he saw them on the porch, a genuine, soul-deep smile that still made her heart skip a beat. "Papa," Samuel cried, toddling toward him on unsteady legs. Elias swept the boy up into his arms, tossing him gently into the air, eliciting a squeal of delight. He settled Samuel on his hip and walked onto the porch, his boots making a solid, comforting sound on the wooden planks. He leaned down and kissed Clara, a soft, lingering kiss that tasted of dust, leather, and a love as solid and enduring as the mountains that surrounded them. He settled onto the swing beside her, his arm wrapping around her shoulders, pulling her and the child she carried close to his side. Samuel snuggled between them, his head resting sleepily on his father's chest. The three of them sat in comfortable silence, watching as the sun bled across the sky, painting the clouds in fiery strokes of crimson and gold. Elias breathed in the scent of her hair, the faint aroma of lavender that still clung to her, a scent that had once signaled disruption but was now the scent of home. He looked at his wife, at the incredible, resilient woman who had shattered his solitude and taught him how to live again. He looked at his son, a vibrant symbol of their shared future. The hollow space inside him, the one he had guarded for so long, was filled to overflowing. "I'm home," he said, his voice a low, contented rumble. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand resting on his, her wedding band warm against his skin. She looked out at the vast, beautiful land that had tested her, and at the family that had been born from that test. She had found her place, her purpose, her heart. "We're home," she whispered, and the fading desert light wrapped them in its gentle, golden embrace.